All right, guys, Mrs. Covington here. I'm going to review to get you ready for the main event of the shot heard around the world and how we actually got to the Revolutionary War. So, hang out. You've been learning in the last 3 weeks about all of these events that have led up to this giant war called the American Revolution. And I just want to kind of put them in perspective of timeline and what happened. So, we started to learn about the 13 original colonies, and they kept fighting at the end of every lesson. In my class, if you remember, at the end of every lesson, they fought with the Indians, and there was people that died, and usually the colonists won. Well, in 1754, we have the French and Indian War, where the colonists keep moving west, and the Indians are getting pretty upset about it. And from the title, you kind of think it's the French versus the Indians, but it's actually the French and the Indians on one side, and the British citizens, soldiers, and the colonists against them. So the French and Indian are kind of defending their land that they think is theirs, and the king wants to keep moving west, and he thinks that that land is his. So they have this big war, and it costs a lot of money. And England fought in a long war in North America against the French and their Native American allies. We have a picture right there. It's pretty nice, right? Okay. And in the end, even though the French and Indians had some amazing war tactics, the British win, and the colonies stay where they are. And the Treaty of Paris kind of ends that war in 1763. And also in 1763, the king has made this proclamation called the Proclamation of 1763, and he tells his colonists they cannot move past the Appalachian Mountains, which the colonists are not too excited to hear about because, one, they've already moved past the Appalachian Mountains and there's people there. And two, they're saying, well, you live over there. How can you tell us how far we can go? So they get pretty mad about the Proclamation of 1763. Then, because the French and Indian War cost the king so much money in supplies and soldiers, he's telling the colonists they need to pay for it. So he starts taxing them. The first tax is in 1764. It is the Sugar Act, and it taxes sugar, molasses, coffee, and cloth. Sorry, I'm going to find here we go. So the Sugar Act raised on sugar and molasses, right? That's just a bag of sugar. And the colonists are kind of like, I don't think so. I don't really like this. We need sugar. We need coffee. We need these things. And now you're going to tax us on them. The next act that they have is the Stamp Act. Now, you would think that it's the stamp that you send on a letter. It's not. It's actually a stamp on a piece of paper saying that you've paid the tax. So we have the Stamp Act, which actually ends up getting taken away after a while because the colonists just aren't paying on these taxes. And so because they're not paying on these taxes, the king is now sending soldiers over to the colonies to make them pay on these taxes. We also have in 1765 the Quartering Act, which most of you said was the worst of the acts. It means they have to house the soldiers and feed them. And even if they are patriots who don't believe this is supposed to be happening, if a soldier knocks on your door, you have to house them, quarter them, and supply their food for them. And so there's a picture for that Quartering Act. It's kind of bogus. You're sending your soldiers over here to make sure we pay these taxes, and now you're telling me I have to give them a bed and food. So now we're spending more money. So then we have that in 1765. In 1767, so 1754 was the beginning of the French and Indian War. And we're now in 1767, more than 10 years later, and we are still getting taxed. Townshend Acts. That is a tax on tea, glass, lead, paper, and paint. So here's a picture for that. They used lead for a lot of things like their musket balls. Okay, so we have glass, tea, and paint. Okay, and people are starting to get more and more annoyed. As you can tell, more soldiers are coming over, and they start to boycott things like tea. So boycott means that they're not going to buy it. Okay, so they're gonna make their own tea, they're gonna make their own coffee, they're gonna make their own paint, and so they're gonna start boycotting these things. The Ladies of Liberty, they start making their own things, their own blankets, their own candles, so that they don't have to buy as much and they're not as reliant on Great Britain or England at the time. The tea tax remains. All of the other acts are rescinded or they go away because they're not really paying them and the king isn't doing anything about it. But he leaves the Tea Act, which British people really like their tea. So before we get to that, in 1770, we have the Boston Massacre. More soldiers are over here. People are kind of rioting in the streets. They have this mass amount of people, and the colonists are throwing rocks and yelling things like "you're a lobster back," because their backs are red, and just kind of being obnoxious. And the English soldiers fight back by shooting, which is unfortunate, and 5 people die. They call it the Boston Massacre. It's a little dramatic, but people did die, so it was upsetting. Crispus Attucks was the first one to die in the War of Independence, so they say. In 1773, we have the Boston Tea Party. So we have the Sons of Liberty, who are like a secret group. They are going to kind of come together and come up with this idea that they need to throw all the tea in the Boston Harbor. So the Sons of Liberty get together. Samuel Adams is the leader. They dump 3 full ships of tea into the Boston Harbor, kind of trying to prove on them. Here's a picture of the Boston Tea Party with boycotts. Right, they're throwing all that tea over into the ocean, made a big, huge tea party. Because of that, the king says, "Oh, no, no, no." And he creates the Intolerable Acts. And one of the biggest parts of that is he blocks off the Boston Harbor with the Navy, the British Navy. So now there are warships in the Boston Harbor, and they are saying that they're not going to leave until you clean up all the tea and pay for all the tea, which is not going to happen. So in 1774, this is something you have not learned about yet, the people are going to get together, the colonists. At this point, there are 13 colonies, individual. They kind of have their own government. They have their own weather. They have their own economy, all that kind of stuff. But they're all going to get together, except for Georgia. Georgia holds out. And they send representatives to represent their colony, and they come up with something that they're going to propose to the king. They're saying, we're no longer going to trade with you unless you take away these taxes. We're not going to follow your laws anymore. We have the right to life, liberty, and freedom. You kind of need to back off, or this is kind of going to go to war. They do it peacefully. They do write a letter, and the king ignores it. And so in 1775, you have the first battle. So the British, you're going to read about it this week, the British soldiers find out that these patriots are going to have all of their ammunition and guns and all that kind of things at Lexington and Concord. Those are 2 cities. And so they're going to go march to go get this stuff and take it away from them. And instead, you're going to learn about Paul Revere, who actually, side note, drew that picture of the Boston Massacre that's so famous. But he's going to have his midnight ride, and he's going to warn the people of Lexington and Concord that the British are coming. And that's his famous quote, that they are coming. So started in 1754. We go all the way to 1775. 20 years later, we have the first battle of the American Revolution, okay? Next week, week 5, you're gonna learn about the Declaration of Independence and how that gets written by famous people. And you're gonna read about in week 6, all the different battles that are the American Revolution. So I hope this helped you understand kind of the flow of how we get to the big moment of the shot heard around the world, 20 years in the making. So a lot of frustration. You were either a loyalist, which means you were loyal to the king and said, no, he's right, or you were a patriot and said no taxation without representation in Parliament. They had no one representing the colonists in all of these decision makings. So that was another thing that added to their frustration. So good luck.